Dr. Eric Helms.
Dr. Milo Wolf.
We all know you're knowledgeable. We can see you're shredded. In a good guest, I look for feathers, veins. Check.
Okay.
And you recently won your natural bodybuilding pro card. But I want to hear today, from a nutritional perspective, what is the optimal bodybuilding diet? What are the most important factors?
Good question. Yeah, I think...
That's Dr. Eric Helms, WNBF pro bodybuilder, author of the Muscle and Strength Pyramids. I had the chance to interview him to ask him how to diet for maximum muscle growth.
I have a hierarchy of importance called the Muscle and Strength Pyramids. We got one for training, we got one for nutrition. A really important and underrated quality of the nutrition pyramid specifically is that everything sits under what I describe as behavior and lifestyle. The most common mistake that people make, in my opinion, is that they will get some of the quantitative big rocks in place, but they won't necessarily have the life skills and nutritional literacy and behavior modification to make those things occur with less restraint so that they're sustainable and they can follow the diet long enough to actually get the results they want or keep those results.
The diet you pick should be the one you can make fit into your lifestyle and stick to, whether that's paleo, keto, or any other diet. It fundamentally needs to be something you can do for long enough to even matter. Importantly, if you're new to dieting for building muscle and losing fat, keep things simple. At first, you probably don't need to worry about minute details like micronutrients and minerals of different foods. Instead, focus on the bigger rocks. First up, the most important factor in your pyramid is energy balance. Could you expand a little bit around that?
Yeah, and this is a contentious one because you'll hear people saying, listen, it's more than CECO, calories in, calories out. And it absolutely is, and that's why behavior and lifestyle is everything sit within it. Most diets that quote unquote work, they either implicitly or explicitly manipulate energy balance.
That's right. When it comes to weight loss and weight gain, whether you're doing a vegan diet, carnivore diet, a paleo diet, or any other diet, in the long term, to achieve weight gain, you need to consume more energy or calories than you expend. To achieve weight loss, you need to consume fewer calories than you expend.
And we have multiple metabolic ward studies where when we control everything, we see the strongest predictor of losing fat mass is the size of the energy deficit, and it almost scales perfectly with the changes in body composition. On the flip side of that, we also see, if your goal is muscle gain, that not sufficiently fueling the process of building muscle, providing the actual energy content of the muscle you're going to be building, and offsetting the energy expenditure increases that come from training and potential compensatory increases in energy expenditure that some people experience while they are in a surplus. If you don't do that, it can short circuit your gains a little bit.
Indeed, in support of what Eric is saying here, a meta-regression by Murphy and colleagues found that being in a calorie surplus tends to help with muscle gains from lifting, whereas being in a deficit tends to reduce muscle growth. Weight gain helps you gain muscle, whereas weight loss facilitates fat loss. However, weight gain is typically easier for most, despite your body having homeostatic mechanisms in place to keep you at a similar body weight.
Because we are not prey animals, historically, we're much better at defending lower body weights set points than upper body weight set points. The dual intervention model is not perfectly and symmetrically well regulated in humans like it might be in, say, a rat. You overfeed a rat and you make them actually fat, then you get them back to an ad libitum diet, they'll come back to a lower body weight. Us humans, you overfeed us, we probably will maintain a higher body weight unless our environment is drastically changed, meaning not being in modern Western society or post-industrial society. Yes, while energy balance is the primary denominator that is going to dictate whether or not you're going to lose body fat, you actually need to think about how do I manipulate my behaviors, my perspective, my habits, and my environment, at least in my home and what I do on a regular basis, that is conducive towards getting into either the small surplus or small deficit, whatever my goals are, to achieve that.
But how fast should you actually lose weight for fat loss so you don't lose muscle?
For most people, depending upon their body mass, that's going to correlate to somewhere between a 0.5 to 1% change in body mass per week. So what your deficit should produce, and this is a way of kind of back checking that it's not too large or too small, is on average, and maybe not looking at an average every week, but every 2 weeks, just to eliminate some of the noise in that signal from water weight changes, is losing roughly between 0.5 to 1% of your body weight per week. So if you weigh 200 pounds, that's 1 to 2 pounds a week. Very simple.
When it comes to weight gain, Eric highlights that the ideal rate of weight gain may depend on your training experience. Beginners can gain weight faster than advanced lifters. How fast can you gain weight without just getting fat?
There's a study in 2002 by Rosnick and colleagues where they took untrained men in a university setting and just gave them an additional 2,000 calories and had them start resistance training. It didn't matter if it was pure maltodextrin or a mix of maltodextrin and protein, and they gained roughly a pound a week of body weight and lean body mass over 8 weeks. They put on 3 kilos of both.
In more trained lifters, however, things are less positive. Both a study out of Eric's own lab and a previous study by Garth and colleagues both suggested that gaining weight at faster than around 1% of body weight per month mostly increased fat gains, without much of an improvement in muscle gained.
So what I recommend is scaling the rate of weight gain to your training experience. Are you progressing quickly? You're probably a novice. Are you progressing at a moderate pace? You're probably an intermediate. Are you taking a lot of time to see gym progress? You've probably been training for a while. And I would generally recommend for the novices to be gaining as much as 1 to 2% of their body weight per month, not per week, and then roughly half of that as you move to the intermediate and advanced stage.
But hold up, what do these figures actually mean? How do you figure out a starting place of how many calories to eat?
Great question. And this is challenging. The best way to do this, in my opinion, is to actually invest some time. And this will, if you are not experienced with tracking your calories, weighing your foods, and getting an idea of weights associated with portion sizes that you might habitually use, and what the energy and macronutrient contents of nutrition are, this is actually a really important learning skill to develop. And what I'd recommend is taking somewhere between 2 to 4 weeks, minimum 2, but preferably closer to 4, and actually weighing yourself at least 3 times per week to get an average, and then looking at your average body weight week to week, just like you would if you're trying to see that weight loss rate that we recommended, and seeing, am I in a slight surplus, deficit, or am I roughly at maintenance over this 4-week period, and then you can estimate what your rough intake is. So if you're in a slight surplus, or you're in a slight deficit, you can determine that, and then you can set a reasonable surplus or deficit based upon that.
Once you've determined what your maintenance calories are, a great way to set a calorie target to aim for is the 3,500 calorie rule. While it isn't perfectly accurate, gaining or losing a pound of body weight will require a surplus or deficit of roughly 3,500 calories. If you want to lose a pound per week, for example, that would simply be 3,500 calories divided by 7 for a daily 500 calorie deficit. Subtract 500 calories from maintenance calories. Congratulations. Those are your fat loss calories.
And on the other side of it, if we wanted to go into a slight surplus, a general rule of thumb is if you're trying to gain in that intermediate phase, you maybe increase over your maintenance calories 5 to 10%, or if you're in the beginner phase, maybe twice that, 10 to 20%. Those are decent rules of thumb, but the most important thing is then adjusting. So if you're finding that you're gaining at faster than the rates we recommended, or if you're losing slower or faster than the rates we recommended, you just increase things down or up 50 to 100 calories on a week-to-week basis once you're looking at these 14-day averages, and it'll auto-correct pretty quick.
So you've set your calories and you're successfully gaining or losing weight. What should you be looking at next?
Well, calories come from somewhere, and those are the macronutrients. We're going to talk about protein, carbs, and fat. And a decent approach here is to figure out, okay, what are the functional minimums I need for protein, carbs, and fats in different contexts? And then from there, I'm just trying to hit roughly something close to my calorie target, say plus or minus 100 calories. And then I can have the individual flexibility to have either a higher fat, higher carb, or higher protein, or whatever approach I want. But so long as I meet those minimums, there's probably going to be equivalent outcomes.
For protein, for example, a meta-regression by Morton and colleagues suggests that muscle growth from lifting can be maximized with 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. For someone who weighs 100 kilograms, for example, that would be 160 grams of protein per day. What about the other two macronutrients, fats and carbs?
For fat, this is something I got to give a big shout out to the other Eric, Dr. Eric Trexler. He did a pretty deep dive in the literature to try to determine what's a minimal fat intake that we should have. What's the lowest you can put your fat if you're willing to really cross your T's and dot your I's and have a really good balance without having too much of a negative effect? And that's somewhere between 20 to 30 grams is what's necessary to probably support the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins and also provide sufficient essential fatty acids for human function, right? Now, it will require a meticulous intake of essential fatty acids and being very thoughtful about what foods you consume. And anyone who's consumed a diet that only has 20 to 30 grams of fat, it doesn't really feel like you're intentionally eating fat. You're just kind of eating and you'd be like, oh, I'm already at 17 grams. Maybe I should have some fish oil and I'm done. But for 90% of cases of when you're dieting, you probably want to be even one step above that, which is the gram intakes associated with our best guess at where we are preventing hormonal drops in testosterone and estrogen. So we have a few different meta-analyses looking at low testosterone and low estrogen in women associated with fat intakes. And when you convert those percentages to absolute grams based upon average intakes, that's somewhere between 40 to 60 grams. And you could probably scale that to body mass. So that, I think, for most people should be like the functional low-end range.
Depending on your body weight, you should probably fall between 40 to 60 grams of fat or more per day, most of the time, unless you're performing a short-lived extreme diet for some reason. Good fat sources include things like avocados, extra virgin olive oil, and peanut butter. What about carbohydrates?
The way you want to view carbohydrate is a little bit different when you have fewer calories or more, just because you're kind of budgetarily restricted. Right? If you're dieting, you're going to have fewer calories to play with. If you're in a surplus, you're going to have more. And I'm very comfortable saying you probably want to get around at least 3 grams per kilogram of carbohydrates if you're in a surplus. But for some people who are just not gifted as far as their energy expenditure, even that is a low-end range when you're hitting the 2 other minimums might be challenging in still constructing a well-balanced diet.
To summarize, here's how to build your diet once you've got your calories in place. First, set your ideal protein intake of at least 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. Subtract the calories that come from the protein from your daily target. There are 4 calories in a gram of protein. Next, set your minimum fat intake. Remove the calories from your daily budget. For carbohydrates, aim for up to 3 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight per day, if you have the calories for it. If you still have calories left over, great. As far as muscle growth goes, you can use up your remaining calories however you wish. Do you enjoy higher fat foods? Have more fat. Do you enjoy carbs instead? Have more carbs. Viewing things in terms of minimums allows for greater diet flexibility. Interestingly though, there might be a benefit to having some carbs right before working out.
One thing we'll talk about when we get to nutrient timing is there does seem to be some relationship between the volume of strength training you can perform when you're given open-ended sets, say 4 sets to failure at 70% of squats or whatever, that if you have a pre-workout meal that contains carbohydrates, you're more likely to perform more volume than if you don't. But the actual dose of carbohydrate doesn't seem to matter quite as much, just the presence of that meal at all.
The next most important thing to pay attention to diet-wise is micronutrients.
So this is things like vitamins, minerals, phytonutrients, and things that are related to the food matrix. I think it's really important to acknowledge that just because we take a reductionist approach to nutrition, especially in sports nutrition, and we talk about grams per kilogram of carbohydrate, fat, protein, etc., we don't eat macros, we eat foods, and probably more importantly, we follow dietary patterns. And certain dietary patterns are going to produce different effects, even if they're similar in macronutrients.
To illustrate Eric's point, let me tell you about a study by Hall and colleagues. Hall and his colleagues took people to the lab and had them consume an ad libitum diet with either more processed or less processed foods. When consuming less processed foods, participants ended up in a 500-calorie deficit. In contrast, when consuming more processed foods, participants ended up in a 500-calorie surplus. So, clearly, the kind of food you eat can play a big role in the real world.
So some of the reasons for that are differences in fiber, differences in energy density, which is going to be largely influenced by the water content of foods and their fiber content and their fat content. Also, the micronutrient content may have some influence on that as well. There's some data to indicate that if you're not getting sufficient nutrients from your food, you might seek out higher calories to compensate from that. But that's probably a minor player compared to energy density as well as fiber content.
So, what should we do? 2 solid recommendations. First, eat the rainbow. Eating a variety of different fruits and vegetables will cover many of your vitamin and mineral bases and provide you with plenty of fiber. A good starting point is your 5 a day. 5 servings of fruits and vegetables across the day at a minimum. Second, the 10-gram rule. Aim for at least 10 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories you consume. At minimum, try to have at least 20 grams of fiber per day.
So this goes back to behavior and lifestyle. even though we want to be eating primarily unprocessed foods that have a low energy density, are satiating, and have fiber, you don't want to actually start to view foods that don't fit that profile as quote unquote bad for you. Because like I said, foods aren't good or bad, we follow dietary patterns. And you can have a quote unquote bad dietary pattern, but having a Snickers bar on Thursday is not going to matter in the grand scheme. And in fact, it might matter if you're so restricted that you feel you can't have a Snickers bar. So if you think adherence to your diet is going to be threatened by you being too restrictive and you want a cookie, go ahead and have that cookie.
A great rule to follow is the 80-20 rule. 80% of your diet should consist of relatively unprocessed, single-item food ingredients, and the remaining 20% of your diet can come from more processed foods.
What's next? What else is there?
Now we got nutrient timing, and this is kind of a catch-all term for anything where we're thinking about when are we eating.
Fortunately for us, Andrew King, one of Eric's PhD students, specifically did his PhD on the effect of carbohydrate before working out on performance. What did he find?
And the overall findings there were that you're more likely to get more volume when consuming a carbohydrate meal either pre or during a training session if you've had a long fasting period, longer than 8 hours, and if you're doing higher volumes. But again, the dosage really didn't seem to matter. So this probably has more to do with either carbohydrate mouth sensors in the mouth that respond to maybe the perception of energy availability, or potentially hunger, which can inhibit performance in some ways. There's some basically oral cavity, brain, gut connections that we don't fully understand that do seem to influence performance. Around training, if you have a leg day especially, or if you haven't eaten in a while, if you're training first thing in the morning, probably a good idea to have a pre-workout meal that contains carbohydrate, so you at least don't feel hungry, but it's not something that actually interferes with your digestion and makes you feel heavy or sluggish in the workout.
What about protein? How many meals should we have per day?
We kind of land upon a minimum frequency of saying having at least 3 servings per day of a rough spread of a decent protein bolus. And that's pretty easy to do. I wish this wasn't true, because it would make me feel better about the years I spent ensuring I got at least 4 equal protein boluses per day. But here we are, folks.
Besides protein post-workout, which Eric doesn't think is necessary if you're having at least 3 protein feedings per day, another common time to recommend protein intake is right before bed. Is there any validity to having more protein before sleep, or even consuming casein, a slow-digesting protein, to get more muscle growth in your sleep?
Yeah, casein is often talked about because it's positioned by supplement companies as much slower than whey. And it is. It's the fraction of milk that is digested much more slowly. It kind of clots into a ball in your stomach, and the amino acids are peeled off much slower. However, it's not substantially slower. In fact, it's a little bit faster than other common protein sources, like most meats. And in fact, if you were to consume an omelet, for example, it would probably take, if it's 4 eggs or more, 8 hours plus to digest. And if you were to consume, say, like a typical porterhouse steak at a steakhouse where you're getting 60 grams of protein, that might take half the day to digest. The first answer to your question is that casein is not necessarily a quote-unquote slow digesting protein. In the grand scheme of things, I'd say it's an intermediate digesting protein, definitely slower than whey. So you don't have to go out of your way to get a quote-unquote slow digesting protein. The second answer is, do we need to have a protein serving before bed? And the answer is probably not.
It turns out that if you're consuming mixed meals, which tend to digest slowly anyways, alongside a sufficient amount of protein across the day, you'll probably still be digesting plenty of protein while you sleep, leading amino acids to your muscles and growing your muscles. Additionally, there's some concern around eating before sleep, disrupting sleep.
The only concern I would have is that some data indicates eating food late at night can interfere with sleep. But most of the time, the potential negative effect is more related to the carbohydrate, fat, and calorie content. So if you're having, let's say, low-fat skyr, it's only going to be like 200 calories, and it's unlikely to have a negative effect on sleep based upon the data we have. I don't have a lot of robust data, but I would be surprised if that was the case. It's not like having a cheeseburger at midnight, right?
I believe there's only a couple more variables in the nutrition pyramid, specifically hydration and supplements.
I've heard if you're super dehydrated, you die.
Whoa.
I've got no studies to prove that. I actually need to see a meta-analysis on them having a zero water or a water condition, or I won't believe it. But I think you can make a reasonable argument that maybe hydration is important for life. But no, more importantly, hydration does have a potential impact on all body systems, and we do know that being dehydrated has a negative impact on performance. and you can't train effectively if you can't perform well. A really useful rule of thumb, though, is just the urine color chart. So after your first urination, first thing in the morning, that'll probably be pretty yellow because you haven't drank water in a while. You want to see pretty clear-ish urine for multiple urinations per day, probably more than 3 at least per day. If you're doing that, you're probably drinking a sufficient amount of fluids.
Why doesn't Eric provide a specific recommendation? Well, previous research has shown that water intake requirements vary substantially depending on body mass, fat-free mass, altitude at which you live, the climate, and more. And no, coffee won't dehydrate you. Most beverages do about as good a job of hydrating you as water does.
The final step of the pyramid, though, is supplements. So, yeah, supplements, they're pitched to us, but they are truly, like their name suggests, supplementary. And there's very few that will clearly and consistently be shown in the evidence to support your goals of hypertrophy or strength development.
Which ones do help? Which ones do help you build muscle?
So the one that is most convincingly helpful to build muscle is creatine. That is present in meat. It is something that is produced naturally in our body, the creatine phosphate system. It's an energy system we use. And it is something that is very challenging to optimize the levels of muscle creatine without actually taking it supplementary, unless you're actually following like the carnivore diet. Because the cooking process degrades the creatine in meat a little bit. So unless you're just crushing sushi, or you got way too into the Liver King and for some reason are also watching this channel, you probably would need to supplement with it to get to a decent level of creatine. And that is as simple as taking 3 to 5 grams per day for most body masses.
Besides creatine, the only other supplement Eric potentially recommends is caffeine pre-workout. While caffeine has been shown to reliably improve performance in the gym, there's little evidence that it improves muscle growth or strength in the long run yet. Likewise, make sure you take caffeine early in the day. A recent meta-regression by Gardiner and colleagues suggested that caffeine can impact your sleep as late as 12 to 14 hours later if you consume a large dose. A good dose might be 3 to 4 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body weight reserved for your morning workouts only. Unfortunately, other supplements don't have nearly the same evidence.
I really don't put much stock outside of creatine, and I don't consider protein a supplement. And in my conception of the muscle and strength pyramids, things like fish oil would fall under essential fatty acids in the micronutrient level. Protein powder would fall under protein in the macronutrient level. A multivitamin would fall under micronutrients. So those you can get from supplements, but I'd recommend first checking in with your doctor, making sure you actually have a deficiency before you start supplementing. And remember that the contamination rates of supplements are surprisingly high, especially in countries that have a post hoc regulatory system where not until there's a problem and someone reports it is anything done about it, like the US, Australia, New Zealand. It's better in the EU, but you're rolling the dice, especially as a drug-tested athlete, when you buy these things. They may not even be meeting the label claims, and 20 to 30% of supplements, especially from the US, are estimated to roughly be contaminated, meaning that you could be taking something and actually thinking, oh man, this muscle building supplement is awesome. Yeah, that's because it might have steroids in it. And you're thinking, oh, that's a good thing, right?
Yes, it absolutely is. On a serious note, if you're going to get any supplement, look for third-party testing labels. You don't want to end up accidentally bald.
Anything else?
I think we're going to call it there, man. I think that's good.
Beautiful. Eric, it's been a pleasure. Where can people find you and your books?
Well, you can find my books at muscleandstrengthpyramids.com if you want the digital. They're also on Amazon if you want the physical copies. If you want to stay up to date with the research, massresearchreview.com. And if you want to find me talking about all the cool projects that I'm doing on other people's channels like this one, follow me on Instagram at Helms3DMJ.